As we continue through this Advent season, as we continue through this time of revival that's a preparation for the Christmas celebration, we continue through our study that is showing us just how to do that. So if you would, let's go ahead and get our Bibles out, and we're going to go right to Nehemiah 3 as we continue our conversation that we started last week. Again, there's Bibles underneath the chairs, and there's YouVersion up and running. But Nehemiah 3 is where we're going to head today, and we're actually going to cover, I think, about 4 chapters today, believe it or not. So make yourself nice and cozy as we dig in. Now, for those who were not here last week, again, if you are a fellowship or if you consider this church your home, I ask you to please go back and watch that video podcast or go back and listen to that audio podcast. This is a very important time of revival for us as a church. It all builds on top of each other, but I will give you just a few nuggets to get you in the general ballpark so you can survive the next 45 minutes or so. We are in the story of Nehemiah because we are focused on revival. And when I'm talking about revival, what I'm talking about is that sometimes as we look in different areas of our individual lives, or as a church as a whole, as a community, we will find areas that God wants us here, that He has called us to a life of passion and purpose and peace and opportunity, but we find in this particular area, that particular area, that we're actually here. That we are kind of living like the norm of the world instead of what God has called us to. And when we identify those areas, again, either individually or as a church, what we find is the margin in between is begging us for revival, begging for us to be revived to where our daddy has called us to be. Because again, when you accept Jesus as leader and forgiver in your life, by acknowledging with your mouth He's the Son of God, believing in your heart He died and rose again, and follow Him, then you have the inheritance of your Father. And so we are striving for those areas to find revival so we can move forward in new and fresh ways. And we've been looking at the story of Nehemiah because it is a testimony within the heroes of our faith that has exactly that case scenario going on, and they do it well. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. Nehemiah lived about 450 years before Jesus was born. He was a Jewish man. He was an Israelite, born as one of God's chosen people, if you look at things from an Old Covenant standpoint. And he was born into captivity. But because of his integrity, because he had the hand of God upon him, he raised up amongst the ranks within the kingdom that he was captive of to actually become one of the high-ranking officials as a cupbearer to the king, which was basically unheard of unless if you read the Bible and you find 4 or 5 of those stories, because God does impossible things. So, as he is in this kingdom, he never does forget the fact that this is not where my true citizenship lies. I'm not a citizen of this kingdom. I'm a citizen of the Israelites. I'm a citizen of Jerusalem. And it is his hope and desire for that to be restored. Because about 151 years before Nehemiah's time, Jerusalem had been overtaken by their enemies. They had started sinning. They walked away from the ways of the Lord, and things fell apart, as they often do, because God knows better than Tom what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. And so as things fall apart, they were overran. The wall of defense is completely wiped out. Their city is wiped out. Their gates are burned and destroyed. And all of the people are taken captive. Hence, 150 years later, Nehemiah being born in captivity. But it is his hope, it is his dream, that over that 150 years, that Jerusalem was being rebuilt or had been rebuilt, because there have been 2 waves of Jerusalem exiles that have gone out back home, and it was his hope that they had rebuilt what God had promised them and what God had for them. But unfortunately, that was not the case. He finds out at the beginning of chapter 1 from his brother that when they went back and they tried to rebuild and they tried to put a brick upon a brick and a stone upon a stone, the enemy would come against it and knock it down, and so they had given up hope. And so what they were used to was living in rubble, when God had called them to have Jerusalem, his holy city. And there needed to be revival. And it started last week with hope. For any of us to have revival in our lives, we've got to be able to have a little bit of hope that doesn't say, you know what, Tom, that sounds great, but every time I try, the enemy comes and knocks those rocks off of the other rocks, and it falls back down again, and I'm tired of trying. I'll never have an area of success or faith in this area of my life. It took Nehemiah to be brokenhearted and say it's not okay for us to live like this anymore. We are going for our God's best. And so that's really what last week dives into in a major way. And I hope that you found some hope within last week. And I hope you found some areas within your walk to be able to look at as individuals. But at the same standpoint, I just want to say up front, as we continue the story, it's a community story. And so a lot of the teaching is going to be from a community standpoint of us as a local body church. That does not mean there's not things here for you from the Holy Spirit as you look at things from an individual standpoint. As you look at the life of Nehemiah, as you look at the lives of the Israelites and how they leaned in, if you look at the lives of the naysayers and what they did and what they avoid, there are still things the Holy Spirit's going to put on your heart as individuals. But since this is a community story, we will be looking at things a little bit more in depth as a church family. Where do we need revival? Where can we move forward? So with that, that's what we dig into as we get back into Nehemiah. I'm going to turn to catch up with you in Nehemiah 3 as we see that they start to move from hope into starting to build as a community. When we get to chapter 3, verse 1, and I'm reading today out of the NSV, which is the ESV, but it's the name simplified version because there's a buttload of really messed up names in here that I'm not going to try to attempt. So I'm going to fake it as we go. You guys roll with me because these names in this case scenario, sometimes names really matter. In this case scenario, it doesn't matter to the story, but I think you'll see what does. As they started rebuilding the wall, it says, Eli, the high priest, rose up with his brothers, the priest, and they built the sheep gate. They consecrated it, and it set its doors. They consecrated it as far as the Tower of the 100, as far as the Tower of Hanel. And next to him the men of Jericho built, and next to them Zacchi the son of Emiri built. The sons of Hesaniah built the fish gate. They laid its beams and set its doors, its bolts, and its bars. And next to them Miri the son of Uriah, son of Haki, repaired. And next to them was Mushi, the son of Braki, son of Meshi, repaired. And next to them, Zaddi, the son of Benaiah, or Banana will say, repaired. And next to them, the Tekites, they repaired. But their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. Now, just for the sake of me not look like a complete idiot, it's a lot of that over and over and over and over and over again through this entire chapter. But the thing that really stands out to me as I read this is the phrase, next to him. What we find here is everybody was in doing their part, but there still were a few that were not. Almost everybody. We find some nobles here in the fifth that are too good to take and stoop down and serve the Lord. But for the most part, everybody was in. And that we find that there's 13 times in this chapter that it says they were working next to one another. Everybody had their part. Everybody did their role. As we continue into the chapter, there's 15 times that we find the phrase after him, where they were building on top of each other's work. So Brett did his part, and after him, Leslie did her part, and after her, Joe jumped in, and after her, Ginger did, and I would say Grant, but you hurt my feelings earlier during the announcement, so I can't throw you in there. But they all did their part, and they built on top of each other. And that's what community looks like. It only happens when there's one vision, and it's God's vision. It only happens when there's unity. It only happens when we're following those who are leading in the Lord. It only happens when leaders are following the Lord. They're not doing their own thing. But it only happens when we each do our own part. If they did not, and they were all doing their own thing, it would be like the previous 150 years where everybody was trying to do this or do that, and it all kept getting knocked down. So, how do we look at this as a church? Now, see, I got a table. And I've been debating this because these are like very scholarly tools. That's really a lie. But I'm going to bring out, after my years of experience, fake blocks. Okay. And look at what does it look like to take and build a wall of defense against the enemy as a church. And one of the things that we know is that there is 5 major purposes of the church. One is fellowship. One is that we're a community and we're loving each other in a way that the world sees that we are different and that we are spending time together, we're encouraging each other, we're challenging each other, we're loving on each other. And that's part within our ministry. From there, worship is a major part of the church and the wall that we build against the enemy to be able to be on the offense for Jesus Christ. Now, worship is not just the music, even though music is a big part of it, here especially with our Sunday morning gatherings. But worship is putting God first and claiming that God is first. Worship is making sure that He's in this proper place and we are in our proper place as a community together. From there, we've got some other ones. This was so fun putting together yesterday, by the way. Discipleship is a major part of growing to be more like Jesus and not becoming stagnant within our walks. Not just saying, okay, 75% is for God and it's going really good, but these things over here, this is mine, and that's just kind of the way it is. If you're going for revival, there is none of that. It is, I want to grow to be more like Jesus. Evangelism is one of the main 5 purposes of the church. Not just staying within these walls, but going out into the community and loving our people and showing people and telling people about the good message of Jesus Christ. What else is there? There's ministry. When I say ministry, I'm talking about personal ministry. That's why Nehemiah didn't call me. Didn't let me on the wall. But personal ministry, what are your spiritual gifts? What are the things that you have grown in knowledge when it comes to talents? How are you using those things for Jesus instead of just for ourselves? And then we would also have to throw in there, let's see, that's our 5. Let's throw in there some of the things that we bring to the table, like service, volunteering, bringing the things that need to happen, that we can't do bigger things than myself if not all of us are coming and working together. So service is a big part of that. Bringing together our finances, bringing together our financial resources, things that God has trusted us to be good stewards of, to be able to bring into the storehouse as well as provide for the things in our personal life. And so when the storehouse is full, then the ministry flows nice and well and smooth. We bring in our resources, the things that He trusts us with that aren't cash, the things that maybe I've shared a story before about a camper I'm trying to sell. If anybody wants to buy a camper, let me know. And that was a shameless plug. But in a gentleman where I blew it, where a guy needed a place to stay, and here I had a camper and I didn't even think about it. There's resources that we can share and bring together when we're coming together as a church. We need, as I mentioned a little bit ago, we need godly leaders. We need leaders that are going to make sure that they're following the Lord instead of their own whims, which means we need godly followers who are willing to be part of that process as well. We need our established folks, people who have been here, I'm going to say established is 2 years or more. And sometime, I'll tell you why. And new. We need our new folks as well. Everything comes together to build a solid wall. But this only happens if we do it together. If we're working next to one another, if we're building on top of one another, if we have one vision, if we have unity, if we're following God together. Here's what chips at the wall, is when we're not doing our part. When we're not all together doing our part. And there's areas, if I'm putting this out there, and again, I think I want to be blunt with this series within our church that are dulled a little because we're not all doing our part. We've gotten comfortable. We've gotten comfortable with this much time is for church stuff, this much time is for everything else. This much maybe money I'll do, or maybe things are tight right now, so I'm just not going to give financially because I can't trust God with that. Or hey, I made this commitment and I know that this is my role in the service area of things, but yeah, I'm sorry I dropped the ball again because I just don't have the time, and this happened at work and this happened at home and I didn't get that done. People taking and looking at opportunities within the church to serve, whether it be with the youth ministry, kids ministry, worship team, building different areas, trustees, taking and working on the building. It could be anything within the church. And you say, I know God's gifted me that way, but I got so much other stuff on my plate. I think I'm just going to just kind of ignore that inkling and just kind of push it to the side. These are things that just keep taking bricks away. And those are areas where we can have revival. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Okay. Okay, I said I was going to be honest with you. I'll be honest with you. I've said this only to a couple people, and that would include the elders and my mentors and my wife, that I have not shared. And I don't want it to come off like a beating up thing, because it's not, but it's related to what we're talking about. If we're talking truly about revival within our church, I truly believe in the 14 years that we have had the Shepherd's Fellowship, and for those who have been around for a long time, know that this is going to be a big statement where other people go, oh, okay. I do believe, personally, this has been the hardest year of ministry for me. Me personally. This has been a very hard year, emotionally, vision-wise, leaning into things-wise. And a lot of it sometimes has to do with loneliness, sometimes has to do with what I see that God can't do with us and what we're not doing. And some of it, quite frankly, I think is we had a really good 3 years, and now that it's dulled, it's just frustrating because I've seen us move in such great ways and such powerful ways that we never could do on our own without Jesus Christ, that have now kind of just are sitting. Building the wall takes all of us. Building the wall takes God leading. It takes all of us doing our part. And Nehemiah knew this within his ministry. Nehemiah knew this within his calling. And the people responded in such a way that they started working side by side and on top of each other. But when you do that, opposition comes. When you do that, opposition comes. If you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about how do you find God's will in your life. Do you remember that when we were looking at Jesus' life? There's kind of 4 steps. It's looking at what you see in your life or what the next steps might be, what godly counsel says within your life, and then you put all those things on a shelf, and then you get in front of your daddy and say, okay, I want to test and know what your will is, where you guide me what that vision is. But once you lay out vision like Nehemiah lays out vision, opposition is going to come against it. And I think that's a big chunk of what maybe with this year is going, is because Satan's just come against the vision. That is really what it comes down to. And so as they move from vision into action, they find that the opposition comes. And we find that it comes in, let's go to chapter 4, verse 1, in the way of some old friends. In chapter 4, if we start out reading verse 1, it says, now when San, because again I'm going to abbreviate names, heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and in the presence of the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Were they restored for themselves? Were they sacrificed? Were they finished up in a day? Were they revived the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? Toby, the Amorite, was beside him and said, yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt. Let their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for people had a mind to work. But when San and Toby and the Arabs and the Amorites and the Asherites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem were going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they became very angry. And they plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. As we look in the situation, this is not a new first time that we've heard of Sam and Toby. They have actually came up in chapter 2. We kind of glazed over them because we want to go deeper into them this week. These are 2 gentlemen who were in the body of the Jewish believers in Jerusalem before Nehemiah showed up. They are not Israelites, they are not Jewish, but they were partners, they were within the family of, they were within the friendships of. And when Nehemiah showed up and said, God has given me this vision to rebuild the wall, God has confirmed it with these 3 things, and we need to strengthen our hands and build, they said, that's a bunch of malarkey. Who the heck are you, and why are you coming in here and causing problems? They wanted nothing to do with it. And they publicly made a stance against Nehemiah. And Nehemiah responded with a public rebuke. And he said to them, you are not being godly, you are not following God's way, and you have in no way, shape, or form any of the blessing of his people. That is a tough situation to be part of. That's a tough situation. We don't like public conflicts. We don't like when all of a sudden there's a separation because there's a truth, and there are those that are leaning into kind of a toxic way of thinking or some other ways of thinking. We don't like those kind of things, and it could seem that Nehemiah was kind of being a jerk. But the reality is, when we look at Nehemiah's response, what we see is one of many examples in what we call today church discipline. That when they had people that they loved, they had people that they cared about, they got off base, and especially when it was a public situation, there is a time of direct communication that is trying to heal and trying to call people back to what God's vision is for their lives. And that process, a lot of times, if we're dealing with sin, we find it in Matthew in the words of Jesus, as far as going and talking to them once, or talking to them with the witnesses, or talking to them as a church. But if they have a refusal to lean into what God would have them to do, then there's a church discipline aspect that really is painful, that separates them, at a certain extent, on an intimate level within the church, because God is holy and He calls us to holiness. And if we're embracing sin, there should be something within an uncomfortability moment that kind of hopes that they will lean back in. That's a hope. That doesn't mean that we publicly shame people. It doesn't mean that we kick people out of church. But there's something there that is supposed to be an uncomfortability. And our response as human beings is to run in with love and hugs because we want everybody to feel good. But there's a purpose behind that uncomfortability. And that uncomfortability sometimes leads people back to the Lord, and sometimes leads them into more darkness. In this case, it led them into more darkness. And what we find is they no longer are talking to Nehemiah, who's the leader over this, is called to it. They're now over to the side in the back hallways, or sitting at Starbucks, or sitting at somebody's dining room table, taking and saying, I'm angry, I'm upset. They're talking about it, I'm downing it. And what they're doing, if you look at it, is San and Toby's opinion now is impacting his brothers, is now impacting the army of Samaria, is now impacting all the ites that were in the area. We don't know how they felt at the beginning of this, but they got sucked into this ugliness. They got sucked into kind of this toxic thinking, and now there's even more of a growing of the two sides, Nehemiah's group and their group, and it's getting kind of ugly. And it's coming against the wall. If Satan can just kind of get in and chip away some of these things, if he can just kind of get us upset to the point that I don't want to share my resources and stuff because things weird at the church, or, I feel like I've been here for a long time, but it doesn't feel like the way it used to, and so now I'm kind of pulling back a little bit, or maybe Tom is a joke behind the scenes, or whatever the case may be. It's a chipping away at the wall, and it's the way that they're coming against it. And when it comes against that, when you have the vision and you go into the opposition, what do we say? We say you have to be able to build and defend at the same time. And that's all of us. As we continue into chapter 4, we get to verse 11. It says, our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in the open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords and their spears and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. And fight for your brothers, and fight for your sons, and fight for your daughters, fight for your wives, and for your homes. When they faced opposition as a community, then they made a stand together as a community. And when you have a situation like that, like Kay was talking about, there's a billion things that try to steal our joy. And this definitely is the case, steal our peace, I'm sorry. It's definitely the case in a situation like this. And Nehemiah, when he stands amongst them and says, here's the secret of keeping your peace in the midst of something like this. Remember God. Don't be afraid. Remember God. Remember that He's awesome. Remember He's secure. Remember His promises. Remember that He's true. And He's got this in His hands. He has full dominion over everything that we're trying to do, and He has full dominion over those who are opposing us that need His love and grace. We all have free will, and we get to decide if we get to be part of it or not, but God's in control. Don't be afraid. It's okay. And build, and fight, and defend, and act together. That is where our peace comes from. God's in control. I'm doing my part. Everything after that is just outside my control, but it's in His. Does that make sense? Are we still together? As they continue to build together, it gets a little crazy. Some of the stuff they do, if you continue in through 4 and continue in through 5, they start building again, but it's not at the same pace as what it was before. We find that Nehemiah takes half of the people that were working before, and again, this is everybody within this. He takes half of them and says, you guys keep building. The other half, stop building and pick up weapons and defend those that are building the wall. So now the wall is not being built anywhere near as fast as it was, but the wall continues to be built. For those who are working, he says, I want you to take care of your hammer in one hand and your weapon in the other. So when you're on the wall, if an attack comes against you, you're ready to defend yourself. And I'll tell you what, I am completely inept when it comes to doing home improvement. I can't imagine trying to hammer something up against the wall while trying to hold a dagger in the other hand. It slows things down. It becomes more challenging. But the wall continues to be built. At the same time, he tells them, not only are you to hold these two, but I want everybody to strap a sword onto their side. And if you ever try to build a wall where you got this big old sword sticking out of you, that becomes kind of a challenge too. And that's definitely going to become a frustration and a challenge, but you know what? The wall continues to be built. And when you hear the rally cry, which means the enemy's coming against us, there are points that we're going to gather and we're going to defend each other and protect each other. And that's going to stop all of production for a moment. But when that fighting is done, the wall is going to continue to be built. Because not just in the offense, but in the defense, we are together in unity, following God, doing his vision, going for revival. As things continue we get into chapter 6. And we get to verse 15 and we find something that's pretty glorious. The wall was finished. The wall got complete on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. We're not talking about revival so that we can fix the bills. We're not talking about revival so that we can build the building anymore. We're talking about revival within our church so that God gets his way. We live according to God's way. And anybody else that was a naysayer within it looks at it and says, wow, I guess that really was God. I guess that really was God. They fell in their own esteem and they took and became kind of trembling because God was obviously with this. They didn't say, obviously, Nehemiah knew what he was doing. He didn't say, obviously, the Jewish nation was stronger than what we thought. They said, surely this was God. Revival always is a testimony to others about how good our God truly, truly is. And the only thing that can stop it is not the opposition. Whatever it looks like in your life, whatever it looks like in our church life, it truly comes down to whether or not we say, I'm going to hope, I'm going to pray, I'm going to fast, I'm going to confess, I'm going to serve, I'm going to move in action, I'm going to lean in and let God have revival so God gets the glory. If you lose this place and go over to Ephesians 4, and you don't have to stay in Nehemiah, we'll kind of bring things up to us here. In Ephesians 4, we have kind of a common group of verses, but as I was thinking about this, these verses just kept coming back to my mind over and over and over again, that if we were going to respond in any way, shape, or form as a community that wants to have the vision of God ruling in our lives, then we'd certainly have to go to Ephesians 4, verse 11, where Paul writes, he gave us apostles, he gave us prophets, he gave us the evangelists and the shepherds and the teachers to equip the saints, not to do the work by themselves, but to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maintain manhood, to the measure, the stature, the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, not carried about and thrown around by human cunning or craftiness and deceitful schemes. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. When I talk about being a tough year, I'm not talking about Tom sitting up here saying, I'm doing everything and nobody's doing anything else. We've got incredible servants within this church. We've got incredible support from many people who have not wavered in their support in different ways for over a decade. But there's other areas where we truly are losing ground. And so as we talk about moving into a time talking about being meaningful and what it means to be a meaningful church or meaningful body or meaningful fellowship or meaningful anything within any of these blocks up here, it's simply saying, can we just stop and breathe? All of us. Because most of the struggle comes from fear, stress, and being overwhelmed. And just take a moment and just say, my Father's in control. I remember my Father. I will make a stand for my Father because He's awesome and He's great. And I'll do my part. I will be faithful and I will follow Him. And everything else is to His glory because He's building a testimony in your lives, in my life, in our communal life that will bring glory to His name. And if there's any Christmas present we can give back to the Lord, it's just being His church, being His children, being His family is better than anything else I've got on my agenda right now.